Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, it is an absolute pleasure to introduce this virtual event with Nicola Griffith presenting her latest novel, Spear, in conversation with Alix E. Harrow. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight through virtual events like tonight's, and in a twist or breaking news, reintroducing some in-person events at Harvard Bookstore and also at the Brattle Theater. Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and continuing to bring them to our ever-expanding digital community. Every week, we are continuing to host events here on our Zoom account. Please check the event schedule on our website at harvard.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, please click on the Q&A button on your screen and we will get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom that you are using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I will be posting a link to purchase copies of Spear on harvard.com. Your purchases make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. And we thank you so much for continuing to turn out and support the bookstore through your presence, not only at these virtual events, but also beginning with the in-person presence in our store. And we also, of course, thank you for your support of our fantastic staff of booksellers at the store. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And lastly, as you have likely experienced in virtual gatherings such as these, technical issues may arise. We, of course, hope that they do not, but if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Nicola Griffith is a native of Yorkshire, England. Her novels include Hild and So Lucky. Her essays, opinion pieces, reviews, and short fiction have appeared in an assortment of academic texts, the New York Times, NPR, and Literary Hub. In 2015, Nicola founded the Literary Prize Data Working Group, whose purpose initially was to assemble data on literary prizes in order to get a picture of how gender bias operates within the trade publishing ecosystem. Alix E. Harrow is a New York Times best-selling and Hugo Award-winning writer living in Virginia with her husband and their two semi-feral kids. She is the author of the 10,000 Doors of January, The Once and Future Witches, and various short fiction. Tonight, they'll be discussing Nicola Griffith's new novel, Spear, and with her new novel with an unforgettable hero and a queer Arthurian masterpiece for the modern era. I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Nicola and Alix.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And thank you to everyone for coming. I can't really believe I get to talk about this novella, which has been an obsession since I first read it. I've reread it twice since then, but also with Nicola, who is one of my formative writers that I've been reading since middle school when my mom gave me this copy of Ammonite. So I really want to get into all these juicy questions about Spear, but I think that the best way to kind of know what Spear is and get the vibe is to dive straight into a reading, because the prose is just something special. So Nicola, if you don't mind taking off with a reading.
I will, and thank you. And I just, before I begin, I want to re-emphasize what Nell said. Please, please, please buy a book either from the Harvard Bookstore or from Third Place Books here in Seattle, who are co-oping with Harvard today for this event, because as the point of these events is to sell books and takes a fair amount of effort for the booksellers to set all this up. So please spend some money. It doesn't even have to be my book, but just spend something. That would be great. Okay, so I'm gonna read, it's a 12-minute reading from Spear, which is set in 6th century Wales and blends Welsh history, Arthurian legend, Irish myth. And it's the story of a young hero raised by her traumatized mother in a cave in Ystrad Tywi, which is a mountain valley in Wales. And this hero, at first nameless, finally gets her name, and her name is Peritia. And she, you will need to understand this for this reading, she learns to understand what's hidden to most people. So she tastes things in the rain and hears things in the breeze, and she becomes, on her travels, aware of this hidden lake. It's this cool, clear lake that she knows one day she will find. Eventually, she leaves the valley to go find this lake and to find out who she is. On her travels, she acquires a bony gelding, a broken sword, the tip, probably the last 3 inches, is broken off, and tatty, much mended armor. And she encounters the companions of Arturus, the king, and she senses these companions are connected somehow to this lake that she wants to find. And she wants to join them, but they tell her basically, nope, they don't know who she is. She needs to go off and make a name for herself. So she sets off to do that. She helps farmers get rid of the bandits who are beginning to plague the countryside. And then one day, she hears of the worst bandit of all, a blight on the land, the Red Knight. Peritia rode now through lands abandoned by people and sharp with the scent of vinegar, where apples, untended, had fallen and rotted in the grass. A good land and rich, but poisoned by fear. Midway across a cold, clear stream, she caught the thick scent of corruption and stopped. She loosened the rein. Drink deep, Boney, drink your fill. There might not be much ahead that was good and clean. On the far bank, she drank to bursting, then filled her leather bottle. She gave Boney the last beans mixed with oats and then turned him loose to graze the paling autumn grass while she ate what she could and saw to her gear. The blades were sharp, sharper than sharp, and well oiled, but she oiled them again, even the pointless sword. She checked her mail coat scale by scale and put it back on, tied, untied, and adjusted the laces until her great veins were covered, but she could still move well. Her cap she turned in her hands. It was a little tight now, but the smith had reinforced the ear flaps and added one for the neck. She put it on. She might wish Boney were bigger, and she might wish for a shield, but this is what she had. In Ystrad Tywi, close to the bounds of Dyfed, there was a blackthorn where shrikes spiked their prey, mouse pups and caterpillars, as smaller birds and bees, a score of dead things drying to husks, hanging as a larder and a warning. The Red Knight had hung more. Bare alders and willows clinging to their leaves grew on both sides of the ford, and the crook of every bough held remains, men, women, even children, 2 dogs, a goat, half an ass, and that was just the carcasses fresh enough to recognize. There were more, many more, that had rotted into strips of leather and old bone held together by a piece of armor, a boot, or a sleeve. In the dappled light on the far bank, mounted on a giant roan, waited a man cased in red leather, sewn with red enameled iron scales. Not just a sleeved jacket like the old thing Peritia wore, but also plate strips on his breeches, a high collar, and gauntlets sewn with small plates on each finger. Even his boots were plated. The shield on his left arm matched. Red leather stretched over wood and painted with a black snake with golden eyes and tongue. Around its edge, another snake, this time of armored scales, glinted in the shimmering tree light. Boiled leather covered his horse's chest, face, and neck. The man wore a massive war helm of red enameled iron, a big two-handed sword sheathed on the left of his saddle, and a great lance tucked under his right arm. Peretir patted Boney's shoulder and could not tell if her horse trembled or she did. Was this fear? She felt once again Angharrad's breath on her cheek. Red is your colour. And that first cool kiss of the dream lake. The lake was her destiny. Her path to it lay through this night. She forced her war hat more firmly on her head and wished suddenly to see her valley again, to see it on one of those precious sunlit days when forget-me-nots lay scattered blue in the grass and the light on the trees glowed like polished bronze. Then a fly lifted from the giant red lance and hummed over the water, and in the air stirred by its wing, she felt the strength of the arm that held that lance and the speed with which it could change the swing of the brutal tip, an edged blade as much as a point. With nothing in her hands but Boney's reins, she kneed him forward. The Red Knight's horse overtopped her own by 2 hands. Boney would not survive a blow to his head or neck from those plate-sized hooves. And that shield. She took a deep breath. I am Peretir, Palladir here. She used her lungs, large from years of running the valley, and her gut muscles, and her voice belled and boomed like a huge hound. In the name of Arturus King, your life is forfeit. With Boney's first step into the river, the knight's memory of sharpening the scales around the shield rim unfurled in her mind like a scroll. When the knight kicked his own giant mount forward, its tail flicked an alder at the water's edge, and she knew from the scent of its bark that, hidden from sight, another 2 spears were propped against its trunk, waiting. She kicked Boney into a trot and he splashed water high around him in a brave show. And with her knees holding him steady, she pulled out her boar spear, which she tucked under her left arm, then her javelin, which she held easy in her right. She swayed with Boney, loose and lithe as the river, while the bandit knight bore down on her like a red tide. He was ferment and rot, wearing the gear of a prince, a wave of blood and rage. Send me strength, she called in her heart, kicked Boney to a gallop, and hurled her javelin hard and true. It took the shield near its edge and swung it into his lance, nudging it off its line, just as she and Boney swept past inside the reach of the Red Knight's blade, close enough to feel the wind of the shield as it missed, then swerved and thrust her boar spear at his thigh, and they were past. Both horses turned. Peretir wiped at her jaw. Blood dripping down her cheek. The red shield had not missed. She put it from her mind. The knight shook his shield, but the javelin had burst through leather and wood and was unmovable. He threw down the shield and kneed his mount into a tight turn. He was bigger. His mount was bigger. His lance was bigger, and he knew this river. She could not win. But as he came, Peretir felt through her palm the wood of her spear, from the wood the blade, and at the tip of the blade a taste of blood, not much blood, for she had barely pricked him, but now she could feel his life, feel the Red Knight as she felt herself. Now his knowledge was her knowledge. She felt his belly tighten as he lifted his lance a fraction and knew he planned to lower the point and take Boney in the lung. She felt the movement of his eyes as he searched for and found the telltale runnel of water where a hidden tree root might trip the unwary. Even as she felt it, she lifted Boney to a jump up over the root and pulled her tipless sword free. As his lance point dropped, she slashed down, taking off both blade and a handspan of shaft just before it slammed into Boney and sent him crashing down in the water. She leapt free, waist deep, boar spear in one hand and pointless sword in the other, and as the knight thundered past, she swang again, hard, high up along the shaft of his lance, leaving him holding a stub. He tossed the stub aside and spurred his horse for the bank, for the tree, and the hidden spears. She could not move fast against the weight of water, not as fast as a mounted man. So she did the only thing she could and hurled the boar spear across the horse's path, straight into the bank. The roan caught its leg and went down. The red night rose, a red raw mountain, rose and pulled his sword free from the thrashing horse. They stood opposite one another, she to her waist in the water, he with his back to the bank and only to his knees. She moved on a slant closer to the bank to where he knew, as now did she, that the riverbed sloped up towards the grass. Now she was only thigh deep. They faced each other and the sun shone full on the bandit knight's face. His eyes were glass green, almost wholly green, with centers tight as pinpricks. "I'll hang you," he said in a voice harsh as gravel. "I'll hang you alive, pinned by your own spear, but not through anything vital. I'll eat your horse while you watch, and every day I'll cut a piece from you and laugh as you rot and beg to die." And he waded towards her. She could do nothing but watch him come. She felt the power of his muscle against the weight of water, saw the length and weight of his sword, knew the strength of his armor on his throat and chest and arms and belly and thighs. Her sword could not stab through that armor. It had no point. She would die hanging on his tree. Her legs trembled. She could not stand against him. So she did not. As the wake of his travel washed against her, and that great sword drew back for a scything cut that would take an arm or her head, she breathed deep and dived flat under the water, under his blow, and slid the edge of her blade across the inside of his knee, where a riding man never wore armor, could not wear armor. He stumbled to one knee, and she pulled her pointless but razor sharp, oh, sharper than sharp, sword back along the inside of the other knee, slicing it open deep to the bone. He fell sideways and she pushed herself up, breathing hard, to one knee and one foot, the foot on his sword trapping his blade, and thrust her own pointless sword down against his chest, pushing him under. As she got her feet under her, she shifted and lifted her sword and thrust down again, this time on the plate across his throat. She leaned her whole weight on the flat tip of the blade, leaned and leaned, gasping, holding on while he thrashed, holding on even as the water turned red around him and he went still, on even as he sank, exhausted, even as she sank, exhausted to her knees, still holding, still leaning, until Boney, limping, nosed the back of her neck, and she fell against him, weeping, the blood running down her face, mingling with blood from the ragged tear on Boney's chest, and running with the river away.
Ooh, ooh. This is
And
when
I just want to reassure everybody that no horses were harmed in the making of this reading. Seriously, both horses are fine. Boney gets a little manly sort of scar on his chest, but that's it. They're both fine.
Actually very important, considering some emails that I've gotten. Had a dog in one book, and you really don't want to put animals in peril without clarifying that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know how to gracefully come down from that incredible reading. I assume everyone needs a moment to order additional copies of the novella. Also, I don't know if you can see it very well, but just so everyone knows, Ravina guided illustrations throughout the novella, and they're incredible, wonderful, in addition to the cover. Yeah. So just to start with the kind of mundane and obvious question, let's do Spear's origin story. Where did this book come from?
I'll tell you how the writing of it happened. I think that's probably the simplest way in. When was it? The end of 2019, I had email from Jen Northington asking me if I would write a short fiction for an anthology that she and Swapna Krishna were putting together called Sword, Stone, Table. There you go. Which was going to be a race-bent, gender-bent, queer Arthurian retelling. I think I've got it right. And I've always loved Arthurian legend, but I really didn't like how Arthurian legend was used. And I didn't see a way to really break it open and for it to still feel Arthurian. And so I said, no. But they are, they're editors, right? They have a point of view. So they basically said, yeah, no, please, really. And I said, well, okay then. And but the deadline wasn't for like 3 months, so I just cashed their check and went back to Meanwood, which was actually going quite well. And I thought, I want to stay focused. I'll get to the story in a bit. And then I completely forgot about it. I mean, I just spaced. And so one day I got the email saying, hi, so the story is due tomorrow. And I'm like, okay. I said, it's going to take me another couple of weeks, but I'll get it to you. Because I'd had this vision when I was about to say no the second time, but then I said yes, because this vision dropped into my head of this person wearing really tatty and mended armor and holding a red spear on a really bony horse in this dark wood. And that vision gave me the way in. And I can talk more about that later. But meanwhile, it had been accreting little bits of things in the back of my brain. My writing brain's a bit like a black box. I toss things in it and it all mutates and composts and breeds basically and produces things. So I knew it was doing something, but I didn't know what. But when it came, so I set Meanwood aside, opened a new document called Red, and began. And I really, really, really did think it was going to be a short story. I thought it was going to be a bit longer than they wanted. They wanted 10,000. I said, it's probably going to be about 12. Is that okay? They're like, oh, great, no problem. So, I started, and in 3 or 4 days, I had already blown past 12,000 words, and it was not slowing down. I'm like, okay, it's going to be a long novelette, but no. A couple of days later, it was boom, past novelette territory and into novella. And it just kept going. So in 17 days, I had the first draft of Spear. I don't normally write at that pace, just to be clear. I'm not Superwoman. But this was such a rush to write, such a joy. It just came roaring out. It's this torrent of words. Because I knew it was going to be good, but I didn't know what variety of good. I had no idea what I was going to do. Really, I had no clue. And it was there, all whole. And
You've just then described writer's worst nightmare, getting an email that says the story's due tomorrow. and the dream of writing, which is the story just coming out whole and complete and beautiful.
Yeah. No, that is such a gift when that happens.
Yeah. It really does read the sort of torrent and rushing rhythm that you're talking about it being written in. That is how it felt to read it to me. It's a whole piece, and it just moves in a single kind of glide. I really, really love that. But I want to circle back to something that you said, which is, I didn't like the way Arthurian myths had been used. How have they been used that is problematic to you?
The matter of Britain, of which the Arthurian legend is a very large part, is a national origin story. It's all about how Britain became Britain and why Britain is brilliant, why Britain should go colonize other countries and treat people like chattel, and why basically noble white people are the saviors of the earth and have this moral authority, and all the other people should be bloody grateful that the British, more particularly the English, have come along and helped them. And it's been used like that for, I would say, at least 500 years. So Wales was England's first colony. And the first time we got a king of England talking about the Round Table was just as Wales was being annexed. So Edward II actually created a round table and held round table tournaments. And even today, it's still happening. There are currently 3 members of the British royal family with the name Arthur in their name. So Charles and William's son, I don't actually know if you pronounce his name Lewis or Louis, but they all have Arthur in their name. I mean, it's really blatant.
It is.
It's about empire.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. We have a little bit of a problem. Maybe it's mostly an American education problem where we disassociate kingdom from empire and don't understand how long the empire that is Britain has been being built.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think the popularity of Arthuriana, you could probably coordinate it with a map spreading, So I went to grad school and studied 19th century British imperialism, which that late Victorian era experienced another huge, like medievalism became a thing during that era, I think for the reasons that you're describing. So then the next question is, if it is poison, has been used in all these poisonous ways, why try to subvert and reclaim this story rather than, say, having your medieval characters in a secondary world or in a Arthur-free medieval historical world, which you've done previously?
Because I fell in love with Arthurian legend when I was about 8. I loved that sense of the long ago. I loved the landscape. I loved this notion of Camelot, this where people were fighting for the right things. They were fighting for what was good and true. And to me, that was my legend as much as anyone else's, except there were never people like me in it. There were no disabled people, no queer people, no people of color, no poor people. It was just, and very few women. I mean, the women were all tropes, basically. You got your sorceress, you've got your poor, sad wife, or your traitorous, treasonous, unfaithful, etc. The usual tropes. And I just thought, well, that's my legend as much as anybody's. Why should I not be in it? I mean, Crips, queers, people of color, we've been part of Britain since there was a Britain, before there was a Britain. I mean, we're part of everything. We've always been here. So why couldn't we be there? I get really tired of being told that the heroic past does not belong to me. I thought, well, watch this now. Yes, it's mine. I want to take it back. I just didn't know how to do it until suddenly I did. And really, Perretier was the key.
Well, and actually, she is wonderful to me. As soon as the first line, which is like, in the waist, a girl growing, or something like that, I was like, oh, I'm amongst my comfortable, this is my hero, I'm here for her. But she's a fascinating hero to me. So how does she fit into kind of the broader idea of the hero and like the hero's journey, and how does she subvert or fulfill that, I guess?
In terms of heroism, Perretier is not like the Joseph Campbell tradition hero. I find those heroes are very like late 20th century superheroes. They are brooding and they know what they want and they go out and get it, and they don't care who gets in their way. They know they're right, and they just cut a swath through the world, and they just leave behind all this destruction and trauma. But that's okay, because they're a hero. And it's always a one-way journey. You know, they don't ever really go back home, or if they do go back home, they haven't changed a bit. In fact, they very rarely change, because they're kind of perfect. You know, why should they change? And Perretier is not like that. Perretier is basically, she is a hero. I mean, she fights, she wins, she likes to have the fights with the monsters. But that's not really the point. The point for Perretier is that she has to do that to get what she really wants, which is a place to belong, a place to call home. And my Perretier is not kicked out of home. She leaves, and then home kind of rejects her afterwards. I'm trying to pick my way through this without giving away too many spoilers. But eventually she does go back home, and discovers that she no longer fits. I mean, she has changed, she has grown and changed so much that she no longer fits that small place. I mean, she still has great fondness for it, but she no longer belongs there. So Perretier's journey is much more circular, I think, than linear. It's certainly not a binary at all, just as I guess she's not really either.
Yeah, that I found that so satisfying. And a little bit I found myself kind of mapping, it's like a queer hero's journey a little bit, the rejection from home and the seeking of identity and the finding, sort of the accumulation of people around you that function as a family. And that return was very important to me. I really liked that so much. I will be checking Q&A. I swear I will get to that in a minute. I am going to cram in as many of my questions first, but a reminder to put it in the Q&A so that I can actually see it to anyone who's listening. So the next thing I know that matters a great deal in your work is this concept of historical accuracy, which I think is kind of a loaded term, but in broad terms, you could say that like Hild is historically accurate, or at least deeply historically informed. Spear is deeply historically informed too, but there's definitely a sense of the mythic and magical. Why did you move in that direction? What was that like?
Well, you know, I hadn't planned it at all. I found myself quite surprised to be writing this. I really didn't know I was going to include magic. It just, for me, that was just part of the dismantling of this whole nativist manifest destiny crap that's baked in to the national origin stories. I wanted to expand the center a bit. So I wanted Welsh history. I wanted English. It's essentially English. I know we always call it British, but it's essentially English legend. And then to bring in Irish myth, to just expand, make Britain feel a bit bigger to start with. But why magic? I'm not really sure. No one's asked me that before. I think because with Hild, lots of people think Hild is fantasy because it's got this kind of mythic feel, but there isn't a scrap of magic in that book, except, the wild magic of the landscape. And I really wanted the wild magic of the landscape in this book too. I like it in all my stuff, but I really wanted it in this book. But I needed this hero to have something extra, to really be a superhero, but without doing those nasty superhero things. And so magic was the way in, but I didn't want, sorcery spells or any of that stuff. I wanted it to be her connection to nature. I wanted the nature itself to actually be magic instead of to just feel like magic. Peretia is such an embodied character. She learns everything through her body's relationship to the world. So nature is her teacher, really. Her mother, bless her mother, she's traumatized and kind of broken. Her mother could teach her nothing. So Peretia had to teach herself, or I suppose more accurately, nature taught her. The elm taught her, and the duck taught her, and the lynx and the lambs, and she learned from everything around her. So I think that's probably why, just to give her teachers.
Yeah, and it does feel honestly like a very natural extension of the kinds of, it's not really magic, but the almost magic that has existed in some of your work. I'm thinking of in Ammonite, the sort of knowledge of the body and control of her body that she has. Like that's a very like naturalistic, slightly pushing the edges of possibility. And Hild, her knowledge of nature and things like that I think feels easily interpreted as magical. No, that makes a lot of sense. And actually that embodiment is sort of connected to the last thing that I really want to ask about, which is that when we talk about historical accuracy in this period, particularly when you start to deal with disabled characters, queer characters, women, often kind of the measuring stick for historical accuracy that comes out is how grim is it? How much are these people experiencing the miseries of history?
Oh my God, the authenticity of misery. I am so tired of that. I have actually, I've been sent many books for blurbs in the last couple of years. And quite a few of them are immigrant memoir or immigrant fiction. And I was worried that they would be the way that many of these things have been in the past, particularly disability memoir, which is just full of struggle and trauma. And I see that happen to all the time with people I have taught. They're like, well, I was trying to sell my book to the publisher, and they said, well, no, can't you make the character just a bit more miserable? We want authenticity. It's because these people, these straight, white, non-disabled people, just don't understand that the body, even the disabled body, even the queer body, even a woman's body, even a person of color's body is a site of joy and should be approached that way as much as possible. I'm losing track of the question a bit, but.
Well, no, that is the question. That's all I was going to get to is that Sphere is really joyful and so rooted in like a physicality. That joy is not just like everyone gets a happy ending so much as it is even through sort of the darkest times. There's this sort of like deep joy in just sort of existing in the world in your body. It's wonderful. It's very wonderful. I am going to, now that we have 15 minutes left, to look at the Q&A. I actually was noticing this too, so I'm going to ask this one first. So I was reading along with you in the ARC. I was doing the same thing and noticing tiny revisions. Could you tell us about your method of revising a book and how many drafts it has?
Yeah, and before I go any further, the ARC is actually very close to the finished book, but my readings are never as close. I edit the final copy for a reading. And in fact, what you got today was a much less edited version of that scene than I usually read, because I figured we had time to put in an extra minute. So I took out some of the edits and put them back in. Revision. There are two sets of revision. There's just you do the first, a small thing like Spear. Spear it's longer than a novella, but it is very short for a novel. So I just call it a book because it's a book. But it's a short book, and it was all one piece. There are no chapter breaks. And for that kind of thing, I just don't stop at all. I don't revise. I just start at the beginning and boom, go straight through to the end. And so then you've got this whole thing. And then I read it through and fix just the most ridiculous infelicities. And then I give it to Kelly, my wife, and she reads it and I take all her comments and think about them, and then I rewrite it again. Then I send it to my agent and she reads it. For something like this, she didn't really have comments. She said, I said, well, what should we do with it? I mean, like, what is it? She said, well, I'll send it to Sean. Sean's my editor at FSG, who's published most of my books. And so he was like, whoa, well, this is not really I don't know. So then FSG went into this kind of unusual imprint collaboration. So FSG did the editorial, and Tor.com, another imprint of Macmillan, did all the marketing and production. And both sets of people have done a brilliant job. So my editor at FSG is a new editor to me. She's young, she's smart, and she loves Arthurian stuff. So it was perfect. So she went through it and she said, well, this part doesn't make sense to me. And so I draw a little picture and say, well, here. And she'd say, oh, I get it now. Or, well, it still doesn't make sense to me. And I'd be like, So then I'd have to think, oh yeah, she's right, I should fix that. So it's this constant layering. And then I finally get a version that can go to the copy editor. And then the copy editor is like, oh, rolls up the sleeves, and out comes the red pen and starts talking about tenses, and the tense shouldn't change here, and you could fix this. And I'm like, maybe, or no, yes, actually, good, thank you, good catch. But I would say probably a third yes, a third nope, and a third yeah, I can fix a bit of that. But each of those clears out the undergrowth a bit, so it becomes clearer and cleaner every time. It really is, it's like doing a sculpture. First you got the block of wood, and then you do an axe carving, like a chainsaw carving, and then you get out the little chisel, and then you get out different grades of sandpaper. That's how the revision goes. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah. Here's one. You said you've always loved Arthuriana. Are there any particular versions or retellings that you love or that you've drawn on in creating Spear?
I would say everything I've ever written has gone into it. I mean, writers tell stories about, the origin story and where things come from and how the idea began, but really we're mostly making it up. Mostly it's really difficult to tell where a thing really began.
You're ruining all of our interviews.
I'm spilling trade secrets, but so I think my first experience of Arthur was through an illustrated, I think, version of Mallory. And mostly it didn't make sense because I was 8. I certainly didn't understand all the gooshy love stuff. I'm like, yeah, can you just go back to whacking people's heads off with swords, please? But then I found, what did I read next? I think it was The Crystal Cave. No, it wasn't. It was Rosemary Sutcliffe, Sword at Sunset. That was actually one of her adult books, and I read that when I was like 9. So I was, again, some parts were a bit like brow furrowing, but I figured it out. And then I read The Crystal Cave, and both of those books were huge influence on Spear and my thoughts of it. I also read Gillian Bradshaw's trilogy, begins with Hawk of May. Hawk of May is a great book. You should go read that book right now. It's a lovely book, fantastic. And it has magic, except it's the same kind of magic that The Crystal Cave has, which is basically the deity feeds info into the hero, who is basically a tool of the deity, the light, the god of light. And I just didn't want gods in my stuff, so I didn't do it that way. What else? Oh, and also I read The Great Captains by Henry Treece. And I loved it when I was a teenager, but by the time I got to about 16, I could not read it anymore. I saw the way he treated women, and no, I did not like that at all. So I still have it on my shelf, but I will never read that book again. And there's many, many, many more recent Arthurian retellings that who I won't mention the names, but they perpetuate this erroneous historical assumption that women had no agency, women were chattel, women never had a good time, ever, women were incapable. I mean, it's the same excuse of not Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, right? Oh, women are treated this way in this book because that's how it really was. I mean, frankly, bullshit. No, not necessarily true. You have to look at who wrote the histories, and who wrote the histories were straight white Christian men. They had an agenda.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. There's a couple of questions, and I can't pronounce any of these words, so I'm not going to try. Just about the Irish mythology connection that you've built in this. Can you talk a little bit about
the Too Hard Day. Okay.
Yes.
The Too Hard Day. That's how you say it. I have lost the question now. What was the actual question? What?
Just can you talk a little bit more about the mixing of Irish men?
Yeah,
in Spear.
Yeah, I really wanted to, as I've already said, expand the center of the story a little bit. And I have honestly I've loved the Irish stories of Finn McCool and Cuchulainn and all that stuff, and Maeve, and there was this, I grew up thinking of history, Irish history, as much more egalitarian than English and Welsh and Scottish history. And I'm not entirely sure that's true. Again, I think it comes down to who wrote the stories. I suspect it was all very similar up to a certain era. But I really liked this notion of the wildness of it. The Irish stories they're really out there. They're pretty wild, and I just like that. And also, there's such joy for me in this whole magical mystery thing. This whole notion of Ireland and mist and the menhirs, the standing stones. I just wanted that. And that's been sort of washed away a little bit from mainland Britain, I think.
Well, there's also a couple of questions, and these are ones that I desperately want answered, about Meanwood. What can you tell us about where that's at and when we can have
Meanwood will be published about this time next year.
Oh my goodness. And in scale, would you say
it is 30% bigger than Hild?
Oh my goodness. I'm excited for myself, but also intimidated. That's incredible.
Terrified for the bookshelves of the world. Yeah. It's the copy edits on that one are going to be interesting. One of the reasons it took me so long to write wasn't because it was long, but because it wanted to be longer. My original plan for this book was to take Hild from age 18 to 33. But I got to about age 20 and I thought, if I take her till she's 33, this book is going to be 1 million words long. So, and I kept getting really stuck, and it was writing Spear in such a rush of joy that gave me this sudden laser focus to go back and finish Meanwood. So I wrote 46,000 words of Spear. It finished it and went straight into Meanwood and wrote another 140,000 words in 6 months. I was like, wow. So the first year of the pandemic, I know many writers have said it was terrible for them. And it was terrible for me in many ways, except writing. I wrote more in 2020 than any other year of my life.
That is incredible.
And they were pretty good words for me. I mean, they weren't a big whole mess where I had to do a lot of work. They were essentially what people will read. So yeah, it was a real gift. I can't emphasize how unusual that was for me. I mean, this is, and for anyone who is a beginner writer out there, please don't think this is how it usually is.
We shouldn't set our word count trackers.
Yeah, this was a one-time gift, and I am most grateful for it. So I would love for it to happen again, but do I ever think it will? Well, maybe it will. Maybe it will.
Yeah, I'll just wait for my year to come up. That's what I'll do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure that we have time for any more questions. I am going to sneak one in here in the last 2 minutes, which is there anything that you've been reading or finding joy in that you would like to share or recommend?
What I'm really enjoying right now is seeing other writers find their joy. Just saying, so many people get hung up. I'm going to go into a bit of a rant here. So many people get hung up on this notion that negativity and criticalness makes something smarter or better, and that is just nonsense. There's so much research saying that people actually think this way, that if they have a boss who's mean and critical in meetings, so clearly they're a smarter boss. It's astonishing. So what I'm really enjoying right now is seeing writers throw off those traces and say, screw it, I want to read something fun. So in the last 2 or 3 years, For example, I read Samantha Shannon's Priory of the Orange Tree. I enjoyed Rivers Solomon's Sorrowland. I mean, there's a lot.
Which is very heavy.
It's very heavy, but it's also enormously, screw it, I'm just going to do this thing. What else? All the Murderbot books, right?
Oh, a delight.
Fantastic. And your own Spindle Splintered. I mean, it's like, this stuff is great. And I just read just last week, actually, a novella that's coming out, I think, in June, Kelly Robson's High Times in Low Parliament. I think that's what it's called. But, you know, it's just fun. And obviously, all these things are well written as well as being fun. And that, yeah, that's basically what's floating in my boat at the moment.
That is extremely wholesome and wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Nicola and Alix, for this fantastic conversation. Just the reading was beautiful, and I was just sort of pounding my desk in affirmation for like every answer to every question. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Again, I posted the link in the chat to purchase copies of Spear at harvard.com. And on behalf of all of us, thank you so much. Stay well and keep reading. Have a good evening. And thank you so much again to both of you.
Have a good evening, and thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Alix, and thank you, everybody.